I've been 40 years in the BBC, and the one thing probably that I'll be remembered for, if anything, is the night I sat on the Lady Protester live on the 6 o'clock news.
Sandy, you'll just have to read the lead.
15. By the end of the 1980s, new technology was playing an increasing part in the delivery of television news. Anchors could now present live news programmes from the location of the story, wherever it unfolded.
Here a story is coming in from the Middle East, from a crew working for ABC.
My proudest moment in all the time I've been doing it, undoubtedly, was November 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Good afternoon from Berlin. In just 3 days, the world has seen the city transformed from one divided by a cruel wall to one where its citizens from both east and west may come and go as they please.
The breakthrough came last night as the first concrete block was removed by East German workers.
The Berlin Wall was the defining moment when television started to come of age. You really could do live events. The world changing before your eyes, represented on television that night. It was an incredibly exciting moment.
Watching from West Berlin as they've done for several hours, the crowd shout ecstatically, "We're coming."
The Berlin Wall had stood for more than a quarter of a century. But as the concrete began to crumble, ITV's news coverage was anchored live back to Britain.
Here at the Brandenberg Gate, we've seen the focus of the celebrations over the last 3 days, and there have been some truly extraordinary moments.
For Alastair Stewart, the story had a deep personal resonance.
My father was in the Royal Air Force and he was a bomber command man, so I'd grown up with V bombers and nuclear weapons at the bottom of my garden. And if the Cold War had got hot, my dad would have been one of those who, on the instruction of the Prime Minister, would have pressed the alert button and they would have gone off. I knew that, and it was running down my spine as I stood there at the Brandenberg Gate.
Well, today in this special programme, we'll be reflecting these momentous events, what they mean for Berlin, for the two Germanys, for Europe and for the world.
But you just knew that this was a tipping point in modern history. It was the most important single event since 1945. It was the final resolution of communism, capitalism, democracy, autocracy. It was being orchestrated by ordinary men and women, some of them very, very young, on the streets of Berlin, right across Eastern Europe. And we were asked by our bosses to go out and tell the British public about it.
The people have said to the politicians, this is our country, we will decide its future. Alastair.
Thank you all, gentlemen. Well, it has been a quite extraordinary story, brimful with political significance and with raw emotion. It's one of those stories you only see once in a while, and yet it may be the beginning, as I think all of us were saying, of something with a much greater and deeper significance. What is not in doubt is that history has been made and unmade in Berlin over the last 4 days.
For anybody of my generation, 1945 to 1989 could have ended in apocalypse. And in November 1989, it took a breath and decided against apocalypse, and we were there to report it. Just awesome.
TREVOR MacDonald was part of the ITN reporting team from Berlin.
Trevor, what do you think is likely to happen next?
Well, so far, this whole revolution has been led by the people.
But the man who was to become one of Britain's most loved newsreaders had started his ITN career with this screen test in 1972.
The fiercest fighting is still on the northern front, where more than 3,000 North Vietnamese troops are advancing on Hue from Quang Tri.
To join ITN at the time I did, and to know that you were joining an organization which had names like Alastair Burnett, Reggie Bosanquet, Andrew Gardner, just a feeling of great terror. Here was I in an organization which had some of the best respected, most well-known journalists in the country. I was proud and terrified at the same time to be part of this group.
TREVOR MacDonald, ITN, in Johannesburg.
Would I be kicked out after 1 year or 2 years? And how long will I get away with it?
Trevor McDonald became one of ITV's most respected reporters. So how did he end up behind the studio desk in 1989?
I drifted into newscasting. What happened was that the editor, Nigel Ryan, called me up one day and said, "I've been thinking about your career," which was very interesting because at that time I wasn't even sure I had one. He said, "Maybe you can report around the world for part-time of the year and do newscasting for a part of the year." And I thought, all my ships have come in at once. I'm suddenly king of the castle.
And that suits Mr. Begin very well indeed.
In November 1992, News at 10 underwent a radical transformation, replacing its double act with a sole anchor. And it was Trevor McDonald who landed the job.
Good evening. MPs are voting now about Europe and, as Labour see it, about Mr. Major's credibility and authority as Prime Minister.
Single-handedly, MacDonald was changing the face of British broadcasting.
I was the first black national newscaster. I must tell you, I didn't get too preoccupied about that. My preoccupation was survival. Many years later, I would meet people in the street, and some West Indian family would say to me, "Do you know, my son never thought of being a television journalist, but he's seen you, and he thinks this is something he might try." So when that happened, I was terribly proud and humbled by that experience.
Trevor McDonald's presence every night on TV caught the imagination of the British public.
He just occupied this kind of legendary position. It started with Tiswas.
British Leyland announced today that 19,000 brand new mini metros rolled off the assembly line. A spokesman said somebody forgot to put the handbrake on.
The government has finally acknowledged the existence of John McGregor. You know, the transport...
Well, Trevor just was the most popular newscaster.
If ever anyone did a survey about who would you like to live next door to, Trevor. Who would you buy a second-hand car from? Trevor. When the BBC did surveys saying, who's your favourite BBC newsreader? Trevor. It was, whatever the question was, the answer was Trevor.
The first time I read a news bulletin with Trevor McDonald, Sir Trevor, I must remember to call him, you know, I was just in awe of him.
Hasnat Khan has remained silent about his affair with the princess for...
I just remember having a sort of sneaky glance to my side and thinking...
Tonight he speaks to us.
I'm doing the news with Trevor McDonald. And it was just one of those moments, I just couldn't quite believe it.
Good night.
Good night. We live very close to each other, so when we were doing the programme together, sometimes I'd bump into him at the supermarket and I'd be chatting, you know, next to the fish fingers or something, you know, to Trevor. And people would sort of look and think, do they do their shopping together?
After receiving a knighthood for services to journalism, Sir Trevor McDonald read his final News at 10 bulletin on the 20th of November, 2008.
We end tonight's News at 10 with a sad parting of the ways. It's a very special night for all of us here on News at 10 because it's Trevor's last night presenting this programme. I have to say it's been a real privilege working with you, Trevor, even though it's just been for a short time. So on behalf of all the team, you know we wish you all the best and we'd like to say thanks. It's been such a joy.
Julie, thank you very much. For me, it's been an enormous pleasure.
I was very lucky to do what I did, very lucky to do it for so long, and I'm terribly grateful to all those who helped me to do it.
Now from me, goodbye, and from Julie and from the rest of the team here, good night.
Good night.
A few moments ago, Downing Street confirmed a report from the Press Association that Mrs. Thatcher is to step down.
Over the last 60 years, one of the newsreader's biggest challenges has been dealing with breaking news.
Diana, Princess of Wales, has died after a car crash in Paris.
The time you really earn your spurs is when a big live story breaks when you're on air and you have to wing it with just an occasional bit of paper being shoved in front of you, something coming up on the computer screen, or a voice coming into your ear from the control room.
You're planning, you're writing scripts, you're working out what you're going to say, and then at 10 seconds to 10 o'clock, it all goes out of the window because everything changes. And boy, I've had a few moments like that in my career.
My first experience of a big story breaking while I was on air was when Kabul started being bombed by the Americans after 9/11.
Good evening. We are breaking into our usual programmes to bring you news that in the last few minutes the Pentagon has confirmed that America has begun a military strike against Afghanistan.
I've been told to go open-ended, to keep talking.
Now, we should be able to see pictures of that anti-aircraft fire. And
so the pictures I had to talk over, it was basically a black screen with green blobs, as you could see as the explosions went off. On first viewing, it looked like a sort of a fish tank or something. I mean, you couldn't really tell what it was at all. So that was the picture I had to talk about. And then I was told in my ear, don't worry, Robert Moore, who was our diplomatic editor at the time, is coming down to the studio.
This comes in some ways as no surprise.
Absolutely not.
Until I saw his face as he ran into the studio, I have to say it was probably the most challenging and terrifying experience of my news presenting career.
But until that special programme at 8, goodbye.